Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
We find ourselves once again in an interesting moment in time. Both North and South Carolina economies are doing way more than just recovering. In fact, 6 years of expansion and counting now. But the tentative nature many people still have when discussing things like employment, lending, housing, education, infrastructure, etc., still reflects an unsure electorate. Welcome back. Thank you for supporting the most widely watched dialogue of Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and sometimes the policy debates in Raleigh and Columbia seem to proceed glacially or don't have any relevance with what most people are concerned with. Can we afford to move as slowly as it seems? Where do we concentrate our limited firepower? And are there pressure points that will accelerate North and South Carolina's problems toward solutions? As we have done for almost 25 years now on this program, we enjoin the discussion with our panel of experts. And later on, we welcome back a true Palmetto States woman, Mebane Rash.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review features Mebane Rash, CEO and Editor-in-Chief of EdNC, Carl Blackstone, President and CEO of the Columbia Chamber of Commerce, and special guest Mebane Rash, President of Micco, LLC. And now, here's Chris William.
Hello, welcome to our program. Happy spring. Carl, good to have you back. Mebane, nice to see you. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Mebane, you had an interesting email recently. You sent out the brutal truth about education in North Carolina. I'm not going to ask you to recount every single one of those, but it does beg a good question. What is the most brutal truth about education in North Carolina?
So I think one of the things we need to think about, and those were Scott Rawls's brutal facts. He's the president of North Carolina's community college system, and he recently announced that he was leaving to go to Virginia to be a president of a community college there. And I think one of the things that made me stop and think about is that we are at this moment in time in North Carolina. Tom Ross is stepping down. Scott Rawls, the president of the community college system, is leaving. We don't know if June Atkinson is going to run again for superintendent of the Department of Public Instruction. And so it creates a moment in time where we can reflect on education in North Carolina without these leaders kind of guarding the turf and the silos that exist. So we have pre-K, we have K through 12, we have community colleges, we have the UNC system, and then we got a whole lot of people involved. We got the North Carolina General Assembly, we got the State Board of Education, Superintendent of Public Instruction, Governor, Governor's Cabinet, we got 115 districts, we got superintendents, school boards, and they get the money from the county commissioners. We got a whole lot of people involved and nobody really in charge. And I think that's what we need to reflect on as a state.
Too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak?
To have a comprehensive vision of how to move this state forward into the 21st century. We're 15 years in. It's time to have a conversation, I think.
You know, Carl, South Carolina is not exempt from this, by the way, as you well know. Is it the same type of crisis feeling as Mebane? You know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mebane, but is there that sense that it is a critical juncture in time about education in South Carolina?
I think so. We went through this 4 or 5 years ago. We had the same, so it's funny that you talk about that because we had the same dynamics in South Carolina. We have a court case that just came down. It's been a 20-year court case to find what is an adequate education. And it took the Supreme Court to say that the state's got to come back and think differently on how we fund education. That's, again, 20 years to decide a court case. But the same thing, we've got to have a summit on education to really think about what are the goals going forward, because we've really lost several generations of not doing the best we can to educate kids, at least in South Carolina.
Yeah, so is it, go ahead.
And we have a lawsuit too. Leandro has been ongoing since the 90s.
Explain that just quickly for
So Leandro is
non-insiders.
the state litigation that's been ongoing for decades. Howdy Manning is presiding over that case. And it defined the state's constitutional right for children to have a sound basic education. But what that actually means is still in flux. And in fact, Judge Manning has asked the state and the plaintiffs to come together in July for 3 days and tell him after 20 plus years exactly what that's going to look like.
Do you think, Mebane, and Carl, I want you to weigh in on this as well from the Palmetto State perspective. Do you think there's a different urgency around education, not just for the reasons that you said, but also because, and I'm not going to say it's broke, but I'm going to say they're retooling and have re-outlined the DNA of economic development, don't have money, are not winning some projects, like the most recent one was Volvo. And so, by the way, South Carolina's still on the short list for that, so South Carolina's running rings around North Carolina at this point. But do you think that that economic development issue is also feeding into what education is and where it is now?
So in North Carolina, in 59 counties, the school system is the largest employer. There is no doubt that these things are connected.
Carl?
And I tell you, in our state, we're seeing growth in areas in the bigger cities of Charleston and Columbia and Greenville. It's the rural counties that are having the problems attracting industry because they don't have the qualified workforce. So it's got to be tied. There is a significant deficit right now in those rural counties. They can't find the proper employment. So without retooling education, we're still going to be in the same predicament.
So Nikki Haley has turned out to be quite the economic development governor, no doubt. She's got the flag out in front of everyone, and she's running full speed and has done a great job. Do you feel like Governor Haley has given the same attention to education?
There's no question her priority has been economic development. We have a superintendent of education that's elected by the state electorate to run schools. It's a split system, though, with the General Assembly, the governor, and the superintendent of education. It's when everybody's in charge, no one's in charge, is what your point was a few months ago. I would say that's the same here.
Not to belabor this point, the whole fact about brutality and the urgency in education. Do you think we're at a tipping point around education in North Carolina?
So I think we're at a tipping point in that we need to think about how to take some big steps forward. Again, we have 115 school districts. Do we still need 115 school districts going forward with the technological advances that are going to take place? It's time to think about funding, and should funding follow the child? There's some big questions that we've got to answer, and I think getting people comfortable with having a conversation about how to take some big steps forward is going to be tough.
Yeah, okay. We can spend a lot of time on this and really do a deep dive, and will in the coming months and weeks. In fact, we do have a program with Molly Spearman, who's the superintendent of education, along with June Atkinson, together on this program in about 2 months. And of course, the issue of education will be a poignant one. Carl, one off for South Carolina. The Boeing success, to understate it, in the Low Country has had wide-ranging ramifications in so many positive ways. One of the issues that's come up has been unions has become much more active about making sure that they are organized in South Carolina. They are not to this point, at least for Boeing workers. That union vote has been postponed. Does this mean that unions will not be able to organize, or is this just simply a postponement?
It's a postponement now. They delayed for a vote for 6 months. I do think that they'll try to reestablish a foothold in South Carolina. It's going to be tough for them to do that. We've lowest in the country percentage of unionized workers. I think South Carolina likes to be union free. They will have a uphill fight, but that doesn't mean they're going to give up the fight.
Could this turn into a political blood sport between the unions and the state?
Absolutely. I mean, Governor Haley's not been shy to say that they're not welcome in South Carolina. I think that they'll probably put them in a position to fight even harder.
Do you think that Governor Haley's response to the unions, which some have said were really surprisingly strong, do you think that's going to embolden the union to be even stronger?
They will be emboldened to try. It's going to be tough to break into this market.
Yeah, okay. A few weeks ago in South Carolina, a gubernatorial-controlled, a GOP-controlled legislature has done something that many are calling wealth redistribution, and that is sales tax in cities, in urban areas, is being taken away from the cities and redistributed to the urban areas. Mebane, how, besides cities not wanting to lose revenue, is this a real problem for a city like Charlotte or Greensboro or Raleigh or Asheville that are millions of dollars? What's your take on this?
So I think it's a real problem for both the rural and the urban areas. The legislation is the Sales Tax Fairness Act, and it asks us as a state to think about our two North Carolinas, rural and distressed versus urban and robust, and how we want to balance those two things. A couple things, some takeaways. I don't think this is going to be enough to change the trajectory of the rural areas. So even if we move forward with a plan like this, we got to figure out what we want our rural areas to look like and their relationship to the hubs, the economic engines in the metro areas that are really driving our economy. I also think schools are vital. And so we need to know how this legislation will impact schools. And then we need to be really careful not to harm our metro area economies. And so we need to think thoughtfully about those three things and see if this is the way we want to move forward with the sales tax.
Wealth redistribution, though, with Republicans in North Carolina, isn't that seem ironic to you?
I'm not sure that's how they would think about it. But I do think it's interesting that you would take local sales tax and turn it into a state sales tax and then allocate it per capita.
Okay, all right. Again, more to come on that. Yeah. Folks, stay with us. We'll bring our guest on in just a moment. In a few weeks, some programs that are upcoming. Bob McNair. Now, here's a Rutherford County boy that has done better than just okay. He's a billionaire. He owns the NFL expansion franchise, the Houston Texans, and he is going to be on our program. Not just talking about entrepreneurship, but what was it that made him successful, certainly, but what are the issues to pay attention now? That is Bob McNair in a few weeks right here on Carolina Business Review, and then Brad Wilson, CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina, will be here to not just talk about an update on the Affordable Care Act and enrollment to date, but some of the other issues around Medicaid funding in the Old North State and as well as in the Palmetto State. It is always the quiet ones that you have to watch, the folks that don't seek the limelight. Well, our guest for decades has been discreetly working on and in some of the toughest issues that face communities across the Carolinas through organizations like the Hollingsworth Funds, the Duke Endowment, the Palmetto Institute, Blue Cross Blue Shield, the Daniel Micco Foundation, to name just a few. We welcome back to the dialogue Minor Shaw. Madam Chair, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Minor, we spend, so many times in dialogues just like this on this program or at cocktail parties or at conferences and summits or in boardrooms talking about some of these large issues that face us: economic development, transportation, education. Minor, how do we kind of get more folks under the tent? How do we get rank and file? And it's not meant to be a patronizing comment, but how do we get more people with passion? Maybe not money, maybe not with time, but those folks all pulling in the same direction. How do we do that?
I think that's an excellent question. I wish we all knew the answer to that. But I do think that one thing that we've tried to do, particularly in South Carolina, and North Carolina's probably done this too, is we have tried to get the chambers together so that we all work together. We have common agendas, the state chamber, of course, and I know you're talking about more than just people with the chambers, but we do, through the chambers, I think you can reach out to your community as well as any organization can. And then I also think through philanthropic organizations, through foundations across the state, working on the issues that are so important in all of our communities, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education. The more people that you can get involved from the population, from the general population, the better on that. Not just because they get involved, but because also you get a much more diverse set of opinions that way.
Which brings up a good point. On your foundational work, on some of the endowments and foundations you worked on, and you work in grassroots, and political boundaries aren't as much of an issue. Is there a formula, or is there, gosh, let's just say it this way, is there a trick to get folks that have political turfism to drop that and to say that education in both states is critical?
Well, I guess I feel like we've made a lot of progress that way.
Yeah.
I think that we all know that education is the key to the future of our states, and we're not going to be able to have the quality of life that we need. We're not going to have the workforce development or any kind of economic development without an educated populace in North and South Carolina.
Yeah.
And I think that that is something that people can rally behind. The United Ways across both states are really critical to making this work because they have such a broad outreach. And I guess I'm very involved in the United Way of Greenville and have been for the United Way of South Carolina. And of course, through the foundation world, we all understand the importance of education in trying to make sure that you have an educated populace all the way through pre-K, all the way through certainly the grade college and beyond. And I believe that we've made a lot of progress, but there's so much more progress to make.
Oh, I'm sure. Mebane?
So at Education NC, we believe that the issues that divide us matter less than what unites us on this issue. And I had 150 meetings across the state last fall, from far left to far right. Everybody that I talked to agreed that all students should have access to a high quality education. There is common ground on this issue. We just don't talk about it in the midst of the campaigns that happen and the advertisements and the negative headlines.
You have a question in there?
So the question I would have is, I get up every morning and I do news aggregation from around the country, looking at state, national, and local headlines. And one last week caught my attention, and it was in Education Next, and it lamented the death of think tanks. And there was a quote: "The future of quality education research rests in the hands of program officers and trustees at the leading foundations." And I wondered, given your work at these foundations, what you think about the role of foundations in education going forward.
Well, I think that education is, of course, it's a major issue for all of us, and I think there are particular foundations across the United States that are really focused on education in general. The Lumina Foundation is one. And I know the Gates Foundation has been very involved in foundations, in education. Of course, we at the Duke Endowment are also, we have 4 schools that we support, but in general, beyond that, we are also looking at education as a whole. And so all of us in the foundation world, if we are involved with anything, we need to be involved and interested in education, because that's really the leveling factor across our communities. So I think that certainly at the Duke Endowment, we're very involved, and we look at the issues, and we meet on the national level. We try to meet with other foundations so that we all understand what's happening, whether it's in the historically black colleges and universities. There have been a lot of changes and challenges there across the United States. So we work with other foundations in that world, or whether it's in sustainability issues, or even the access to education. And I think we all are involved with that. All the foundations that I'm involved with, even though that might be not be our major focus, we're all interested in that and certainly get together and think about it.
Carl?
Education is huge in South Carolina. We've had this conversation today. One of the things I'm interested in Greenville, your hometown, has done just a marvelous job in their renaissance, and it's not an overnight success at all. It's been transforming for years, but it's gotten national accolades. What is the going forward and looking to see? You've got a lot of new faces in Greenville. How do you see Greenville going forward, and how do you get those young people engaged? They're maybe not born and raised in Greenville, but are new to Greenville, but to see the vision that y'all have had in Greenville. How do you continue that legacy?
Well, I think that's one of the things that makes me happy when I look at Greenville and I look at the people who are involved in the community. There are a lot of young people involved now, and you also have the second and third generation coming back to Greenville, moving back home to work in some of their family businesses, particularly in commercial real estate, and those companies have been very involved in helping make Greenville what it is today and move forward. And we have a lot of opportunities in Greenville for young people to be involved, whether it's through the chamber. They have a wonderful group where they bring young people in. I think they have over 1,000 people who get together and network, who are very interested in seeing Greenville move forward. That's the fact that we do have a lot going on in Greenville and that we've opened the doors and we're putting a lot of emphasis on entrepreneurship through the Next Center, through Accelerate at the Chamber, has encouraged young people to come back to Greenville. They see a future and we want them to be involved. The more involved they are, the better, and we try to open the doors as wide as we can to make sure they will be involved.
You know, let's go back to something. You're talking about historically black colleges and universities, and I can't help but think the woes that South Carolina State has gone through, but not to ask you specifically about South Carolina State and Orangeburg, but in South Carolina, you got South Carolina State, and then you've got on the other end of the continuum, and I know I'm going to get emails about this one, that you got Clemson was named one of the best values in the state. You know, education costs. So in that continuum, Minor, what do lawmakers need to be talking about besides just addressing student debt or accessibility? What else needs to be going on in policy in the State House around higher ed?
Well, I think we need to have more money going to higher education. I think every year we've cut back on the amount of dollars that fund certainly our public institutions, and of course the private institutions also are fortunate to be able to have the tuition grant programs. But the higher education, public education, the dollars have been going down steadily on that. I think the other thing that we need to do is we need to look at our, again, getting back to our K through 12 education system, and we need to make sure that the students who go to all these colleges are ready for college. We need to do a much better job of making sure that they are educated properly to go into the right kind of field, whether it's Clemson, whether it's South Carolina State, and that in addition to that, that they have the support they need. There's a lot of case management involved in, particularly with first-generation college students, and I think you will find that some of the colleges, many colleges, of course, in North and South Carolina have first-generation college students, but those students require a little bit more hand-holding. And I think that's actually been on some national news shows lately. But I think we can do a better job with making sure that our students are ready for college and working with them when they get there.
Mebane?
So that reminds me of people talking about we need to pay attention to the joints, the transition from pre-K to elementary and then from high school to college, and that's where we decide whether these students are really career or college ready, that those joints and knuckles are really important. I'm curious, given the work of the Duke Endowment with the most vulnerable children, when you look at kind of the nexus of poverty and healthcare and education, do you see opportunities for us to take some big steps forward to improve the education that we're providing to these students?
Well, I do. We're looking at after-school programs. We of course in our child care area have been very involved in in healthcare, working together in nurse-family partnership and trying to make sure that when children are born, that they get a good foundation. And then we have worked to try to get the transition so that they are going to be successful in school. But we at the Duke Endowment are paying a lot of attention to that. And I know that in terms of working with students who are the most vulnerable, we try to put our dollars, particularly in the child care area, with students who are the most vulnerable, and we try to help them through the system. And another thing that I think is...
Minor, I'm going to have you come back.
Okay.
No. We never have enough time to do a really deep dive here. Thank you for being on the program.
You're welcome.
Come back, please, and finish that thought that I so rudely interrupted you on, but thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to see you.
Thank
Carl, thanks for coming up.
Thank you, Chris.
Mebane, see you
Thank
soon,
you.
I'm sure. Okay. Till next week, I'm Chris William. Have a nice weekend. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.